Welcome everyone to the Academy of the Impossible and our now weekly campaign school program we started to encourage widespread participation in the political process, primarily triggered by members who want to run for office, but we're also interested in people who want to work behind the scenes, who are interested in punditry, comedy, really all aspects of the political process we like to encourage. Our new format, now being weekly, involves guests on alternate weeks and then more intense sessions for our quote-unquote graduate students who are very serious about running for office and do not want to wait any time to start learning either the skills or start developing the relationships with their future constituents so that they can be elected. We are very fortunate today to have Councillor Adam Vaughan as one of our guests, partly because we are, in essence, a communications school, and Councillor Vaughan's background as a journalist is something that is very much relevant to the way we approach our understanding of politics, but also because municipal politics is the real hot ticket these days, and is certainly an excellent avenue for people to participate and engage the political process. And so it's not only for the benefit of those present, but we also record these for YouTube so that they can be a resource for people who can make in the room. And it's also a lesson, both demonstrated by our guests, but also for the audience, that you're always on the record. That politics is a climate in which everything you do can and will be scrutinized, and we like to start that ourselves here in this environment, in that often our off-week stuff focuses on role play and theater to get people prepared to be able to perform under that type of spotlight. So again, it is of great pleasure to have Councillor Vaughan here today, and the format will be a very brief conversation between the two of us and then opening it up as quickly as possible to a type of question and answer, because our approach to teaching is very much participatory and peer-to-peer. And I mentioned really one of our primary desires, Councillor, to have you in is because you have a background in journalism, and you really do appreciate the role that communication plays in politics. But I also like to start these conversations by looking at when someone becomes politicized. And I think in your case, it might have just been through osmosis, that you were fortunate enough to really be in the midst of, in a nostalgic way, of what's often looked at the golden age of urbanism in Toronto, that your dad and some of the people around him were certainly, for my generation, who we often looked up to as what was possible in this city. And I suspect you may have a different perspective, that it might be a lot more normal for you just because it was life and it was family. But I'm curious if there was either a moment of politicization or if your life was always political, if politics was always the types of conversations that happened at the dinner table, and if that was something that immediately attracted to you, or if you even had a rebellious phase, or perhaps you said, no, I'm not going to have anything to do with this politics only because your family was so involved. I mean, was it a natural for you, or was it something that you actually had to consciously warm up to?
Yes, no, yes, yes, no, and yes. No, more seriously, I guess. I come from, a family that was engaged politically, and not just my parents' generation, but the households they were raised in the cities and towns in Australia where they came from. My grandfather was a city councillor in a suburb or a municipality attached to Greater Sydney called Burwood. When my dad was growing up, my mum's father was the town planner, the treasurer, and the chief engineer, and I think something else in a little place called Mildura in rural Australia, in Victoria. And as a result of that, politics has always been something near the family, and the family it was part of the, not just the talk at the dinner table, but at the breakfast table quite often as well. That being said, I think the interest comes more from the history and the relationship to architecture and town planning. I think that's actually more where the political interest comes from. Mm-hmm. There's lots of different ways to get at politics. There's class politics, there's city building politics, there's power politics, there's nation building politics. But in my family, it's always been about how you build a neighborhood, and that's where I think the commonality lies between all the different professions that my brothers and sisters have, and my relatives have. It's always been engaged at the very local level in building a better neighborhood, and that involves all of the other kinds of politics, from class politics to nation building to the politics that got our family sent to Australia to begin with, which is stealing our horses from the British Army, which is a whole other kind of politics, I guess. But it's always been part of the conversation, and the sense, and I guess this is where entitlement or privilege probably plays a role from a perspective of analysis, is that you've never not had the right to shape the way your community works. In fact, it's a responsibility to stand up and play a role in making sure your community evolves and becomes stronger and better and fairer and more beautiful, a place to live. And when you start looking at those things, from architecture to journalism, to you talked about comedy as a political sport. I was a cartoonist before it was anything above all of what I'm known for. It's always been about engaging in making your community a stronger, more beautiful, more affordable place.
Do you still do the cartoons?
Yeah, actually I do.
And do you publish them or share them anywhere?
No, it's become a way of not heckling on the floor of council.
Nice. And you mentioned that commitment to the greater good, that commitment of responsibility that comes with that political awareness. I assume that's what drove you into journalism, but I want to frame that in the sense that not at all?
No, what I was making a living as a cartoonist and an illustrator, and living in a warehouse not unlike this, and paying my bills and having a great old time. When I had a really bad eye infection and lost the focus and the visioning in my right eye, so that only my left eye does the work, and that's why I now have to wear glasses. But I couldn't draw for 6-8 months, and I was listening to CKLN radio. Some friends had just, Ralph Ben-Murgy and Anton Leo and some others had just started broadcasting CKLN FM 88.1, which is now off the air, but it just started the project. And I would listen to it while I was doing my cartooning, mostly for the music. And with nothing to do for 6 months, and with the Morgentaler trial just about to begin, and with the issue of choice being front and center in a lot of our lives, a lot of the conversations in the city at that time, decided that I might as well go and sit in the courtroom and cover the trial and provide a perspective on it that I thought would extend beyond what the mainstream media was doing, and start talking to the activists and the people who were doing the work to protect the clinic and get women the right to choose. Start interviewing those folks. So I started showing up and watching the trial and interviewing Carolyn Egan and Judy Rebick and Norma Scarborough and all the folks that were on the other side of the prisoner's docket from Dr. Morgentaler, and that's how I got into journalism. It was totally by accident. I was literally an invalid and a little bored and decided to go into a courtroom.
Well, and I think some of us who are younger take for granted how journalism used to go to only traditional sources, and to go and ask the activists, to go and talk to some of those people on the periphery was, I'm sure at the time, not a very common practice. And I could admit that I was never...
Actually,
go ahead.
Let me back it up a little bit. When I was a kid, when my dad was in politics, and before he became a journalist, we were used to sort of the CBC and folks showing up with film cameras and massive amounts of lights to do a 10-second clip. I remember going to City Hall as a little kid and always wondering who was sitting up in that balcony. I always found the journalism process interesting. And if you ask my parents, if you could, about the role that journalists played in the for example, the fight to stop Spadina and the Spadina Expressway in the city, it was critically important to get the journalists on side. But at that point in time, journalists, and I use that to cover broadcast and print and all the other different forms there are now, but at that point, journalists weren't celebrities. They were part of the neighborhood and part of the community. Mm-hmm. And as a result, they were engaged in the change that was happening in a way that was different than it is today. Nowadays, a lot of the, especially as, what was it, 93% of all media is received through the television in terms of journalism, especially coverage of City Hall. The folks that are on camera, and I've experienced this, become celebrities unto themselves, and actually are less and less engaged in the local community, certainly aren't paid anywhere near the average salary in the city. They're 2.5 times more. They get paid more than politicians do. And as a result, journalists now pretend that they're detached, but are actually more product of their status as celebrities and rather well-paid celebrities. And so journalists now are no longer engaged in the day-to-day life of the struggle, regardless of what issue it is. And it's very rare that you come across a journalist who actually has the institutional memory or the community base that ties them to the story they're covering. And I think that's the change that's happened. It's been an evolution of the profession that's more at play here.
And correct me if my memory's wrong, but I remember both when you were at CBC and then later at City that the political establishment, whether left or right, often got frustrated with the way in which you would push a story. And
that'd be very nice to me.
Well, no, but it brings up the contrast that it's almost as if there's...
I never went into it as a profession. And to be fair to the producers and the bosses and even the political class, I went in there. I mean, the motto of CKLN is not that there's every story has two sides. It's that every side has two stories. And we would explore deeper into the issues, and we made no bones about it. We were on what we thought were the sides of the people, the right, the good side. It's like apartheid didn't have two sides to us. It was just bloody wrong. We had to fight it. How do you fight it? Well, you do a story about the boycott one day. You do a story about a visiting diplomat for the ANC the next day. You do a story about Canadian corporate connections the day after that. You don't do a story about how trade is going to alleviate the suffering of the folks in Botswana or what have you. You go in there and you do the advocacy work, and that's the work I did as a journalist. I had the ability, because of my father's reputation, to get in the door to a lot of places. Once I got in there, I went around making sure I found every single radical I could in the newsroom and trying to build a program that was counterculture to what was there in the news. It was change from within that we were trying to lead, and at the same time making sure that we gave, at critical times, we were in a position to deliver a platform to people that were advocating the kind of change we believed in. It was always political, and that's what I think really angered the political folks, and it certainly angered the odd producer I used to work with. But it was never about being fair and balanced. It was always about being political.
Well, and it seems to me certainly that reputation carried on to your life as city councillor, and perhaps motivates a lot of the vitriol and hostility that you receive from the media, in addition from your opponents. Sorry, go ahead.
I think that I dispense. No, look at it. It's called a fight and a struggle for a reason, and there are entrenched interests in this city that are now closely aligned with the media, and the media is owned by fewer and fewer people, and the media has become a tool of right-wing political organizers. It's more apparent in the States, but it's present here as well. Ted Rogers was a very right-wing person, and his network is very right-wing. The Bassett family and the folks that owned CFTO, it was TO's for Tory, right? I mean, there's no two bits about it. The Globe and Mail has a political perspective. John Stackhouse is what he is and is who he is, and I've worked around these folks for a while. You can't tell me that any newspaper that employs Paul Godfrey is seeking to be fair and balanced. I mean, Jeff Lyons' niece, Sue Ann Levy, covers City Hall, never covered MFP. So there is, for every one of me, I can name you 10 of them. And that's the way it is. And all journalism, I think, is political. I think some of it masquerades as fair and balanced, or there are some in the profession that still cling to the ideals of journalism school. But out in the trenches, it's a very different story.
Well, and it certainly speaks to how you, as a political candidate, therefore appreciate communications. And within the context of campaign school, I don't want to exclusively focus on the role of communication in campaigns, but of course the other aspects of campaigns. And I'm curious, I mean, obviously you've had limited electoral experience as yourself, but through your dad's campaigns, I mean, were you able, before you got into politics, to get your own lessons around either how important constituency relationships are or the other aspects of campaigns beyond communications? Or were you going in somewhat a novice? I mean, to what extent were you comfortable? To what extent was your first campaign as city councillor something that you felt knowledgeable about and going into as someone who knew what you were getting into? Or were you a rookie? I mean, to what extent were you starting fresh?
I'd be fooling you if you said I was a rookie. I understood intrinsically what was required in terms of how to build a campaign team. I'd watched my dad build them. No one knows my mother very much, but she was one of the great canvassers and one of the great political organizers in the city, and a large reason as to why my father was successful. I was always around a campaign room as a kid, and I was always in them in high school, and when I was a journalist, it's the way I used to cover elections. I didn't really care much for the leadership debate or the bus coming through town. I made a practice of studying how campaigns were organized, what they were doing on the ground. As I was riding here, I was thinking, having not been at the NDP convention this weekend, one of the things that Mike Layton and I had talked about, although I think he's getting married and can't do it now, but we were talking about going down to watch the Republican convention in Tampa Bay, just to figure out what the hell they're up to, because they're up to something. And you can see that the techniques that Ford employed in the last election, which are now distributed across the political spectrum, but were you knew when he did them. There were some very effective political campaign lessons inside that campaign. And so you watch all of that stuff, and you're constantly putting together, I think, the strategies, the structures, the techniques, and evaluating how they work and how they don't work in certain climates.
Mm-hmm. And part of that was to build to the issue of the role of parties in the municipal level, because it's something that comes up a lot, both here at campaign school and amongst sort of those of us who are interested more in facilitating participation. And your race almost defies that, because you were up against both essentially an incumbent infrastructure that was organized as part of a larger, not open, but what everyone calls a political party at City Hall, and yet you were able in a very competitive race, in a very crowded race, to succeed. And do you think, I mean, I'm asking two questions. One, are political parties relevant at City Hall? And two, is it difficult to go against them? Is it difficult to try to be literally an independent city councillor who doesn't have to be part of a larger sort of slate of candidates, I guess, is the closest I think Toronto comes to a political party?
I think a strong independent candidate will beat a strong party candidate any day at City Hall. I think that people want to know. I mean, picking up garbage is not a partisan issue. It's barely an ideological issue beyond the managing of which contract gets let to who, whether it's a worker or a corporation. But independence, as I often said when I was campaigning against Helen Kennedy and the Leighton Chow NDP team. My job is not to represent a political party to you, it's to represent you to City Hall and fight for you at City Hall, and I will do it regardless of which lawn sign you put up at the provincial or federal election. And so it was easy to position it that way and to make people understand why independence was required to be a good, effective local councillor. And I think that while political parties are present at City Hall, it's the candidates that can reach across political divides and across neighborhood divides or geographic divides or even ideological divides that are going to win every single time, and that is part of the message you have to deliver. That being said, when you're part of a party or when you're a candidate with party affiliation, you can dial up 2 or 3 telephone numbers and get 60 or 70 people out on a weekend very quickly. You can do the same if you've got connections to unions. You can do the same if you've got connections to large corporations sometimes. It's about the networks you create, and not all networks that are effective are necessarily bannered under a political party. But you do need those networks. But running against a political machine, it just means you have to work harder and you have to understand how they operate. And we understood exactly how the NDP operated in that riding. We'd watched enough of their campaigns. Mm-hmm. I'd watched Jack and Olivia put together campaigns in those neighborhoods. I knew what we were up against, but I didn't go into it naive. I don't think party affiliation. In fact, I think if I had been a liberal, I probably would have been beaten. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that party affiliation works. I think that there is in the city, however, a need for progressive ideas and people with those progressive ideas to coalesce around certain races in the next election in order to make sure that we don't end up in the situation we're in right now, and I think that's critical. And so that conversation is starting to happen more and more. It's not a party structure or a platform or a candidate selection process, which the NDP went through in my ward and I profited from. The division in their party was a large part of why I won the election, and I would have won it going either way. Whichever way that party split, it was determined to have a fight and split itself in two, and that was helpful. But I think that there needs to be an understanding that we're going to have to make some smart choices and knock off some people next time from the council perspective. And I guess it's pretty certain that if that happens, we're probably going to get a new mayor by default.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's interesting you talk about the network building and the importance of that network building, especially as an independent. And when Shelley Carroll was here, she talked a lot about the relationship that she fosters with volunteers, both when she's out canvassing in terms of taking those weak bonds and cementing them into stronger bonds, but also how she would understand all the work that needed to be done in a campaign and would therefore be able to have a much closer relationship with each level of the volunteer workers. Now, I'm certainly not interested in that same level of detail, but I'm curious to hear about how you motivate and how you build that network. And I mean, obviously, as a city councillor, it's very much focused on municipal issues versus, as you were saying, a political party that can call people up and get 60 folks for a weekend. So what do you have to do then to motivate people, to encourage people to be part of your team as volunteers? And then do you continue to keep them involved in between actual election campaigns?
To varying degrees. I think in Shelley's ward, there isn't as long or as strong a tradition of civic activism. Mm-hmm. The ward that I represent, which is the Annex and Seton Village and the university community around Harvard Village and Kensington and the Grange, and then south of Queen Street, it changes altogether again and becomes a new neighborhood of high-rise communities. But then you get the waterfront, and you get the Island Airport fight and the waterfront community. There are groups, whether they're neighborhood agency or issue-based groups, that are highly engaged in the civic dialogue and understand their role at City Hall to be one in which they have to show up, not just at election time, but between elections as well. And so there's a very high degree of urban activism in the ward to begin with. Mm-hmm. And I think that the other thing that we try to do consciously is bring big ideas to the larger public and bring the larger public, not just ward residents, into the campaign around the notion this is a place where ideas are going to have currency. And with that, and with the constant sort of focus on trying to be out in front of the kind of thinking around what defines a great city or a strong neighborhood or good community economic development or social development or even cultural development, putting those ideas in front of people draws people in. And when we get them in, we get them there not because we're sort of facilitating that one-on-one relationship so much as we're recognizing, as Jane Jacobs would tell you, that the expertise of the ordinary person is actually critical to not only fostering a climate of change, but actually delivering real change in the city. And so it's that sense of a crusade more than a network of relationships. But there are networks of relationships which we pull on to get folks out as well.
Well, and you're right to cite your particular ward and its wealth of social capital and its wealth of social organizations that are able to then back you up as a councillor. But it's also interesting how you talk about the role of big ideas, because it's an absolute contrast to our mayor, who, I mean, his claim to fame is constituency relations, right? I mean, that's all he did as city councillor.
I would give him 3 pillars that his stool rests on. One of them is that hands-on constituency work, and he continues to do about 20 to 30 calls a day and builds that brand continuously. The second one is a politics of the word no. Mm-hmm. He is your candidate. He is Dr. No. If you want something said no to, he will say no to it. Too big, mm-hmm. too small, too fast, too slow, above grade, below grade, whatever it is, he'll say no to it for the reasons that he thinks that he can profit from. He's a capital O obstructionist. Mm-hmm. So that's another part of it. And then the final piece of it is that he doesn't think that government should exist. Mm-hmm. And so he will starve every penny of tax the government gets, and sell off every asset that is accrued to the government to go forward. So between saying no and not doing anything, no and not taxing for anything, but yes, I'll give you service. Mm-hmm. He quite often runs into his own contradictions, and that's what's been helping us at City Hall lately.
Well, and I think also it brings up the myth that I think should be shattered, which is that often the current opposition is not there for the constituent. And obviously that's a myth that I think
you don't get elected and you don't get re-elected unless you fix fences and cover up potholes.
And so that's what I want to know for
all
you
weekend long. You get emails from folks saying someone's sleeping in the park.
So for you as a councillor,
you've got to respond.
You know, a twofold question. In the context of a campaign, how much of it for you is canvassing? And in the context of being a city councillor, how much of it is constituency work?
When I maybe it's a little old school, but I canvassed in the first election from May through to October, every day, from 8 in the morning, 7:30 in the morning, right through to 9 o'clock at night. Well over 15 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Was there any street in the ward that
every
you missed?
street? Every street was hit 3 times.
And now, as
every subway station was hit continuously on a 5-day cycle. I mean, I've got 9 subway stations, so actually I think it's 11 subway stations. It was every subway station, it was streetcar stops, it was every, the Kensington Market on Saturday, everywhere you went you were canvassing, and you always had a bag with you full of flyers and buttons.
And the unanimity of all of our guests here has been that it is that human contact that is essential.
With the candidate.
Yeah.
I think there's a political science sort of thesis that if you shake a person's hands twice, you have a 75% chance of getting their vote.
And what about now?
Regardless of what position you take on any of the issues.
And what about now as councillor? How much of your work is constituency work?
Personally, it's less this term than last term, only because we've had a lot of citywide fights to deal with, and the Ford agenda has required a different kind of political activism at City Hall. We've had to really manage watch the committees and be present on those, and we've had to do a lot more citywide messaging to try and, the media was very difficult for the first 6 months of the term, and we had to flip them around. And we had to, as well, start building relationships with the other councillors that were new, not necessarily the councillors inside the Ford team. So there's been less hands-on constituency work this time by me, but at the same time, I've got an office, and I've been very fortunate to have virtually the same staff I started with 6-7 years ago, which is not normal at City Hall. The turnover is usually pretty high. But we've left them in very sort of one-on-one situation. People in the office know, Rebecca's in the north and Jen's in the south. They know that Ange handles sort of the big projects, and they know that if they need to make an appointment, it's Mike you call. And having locked in that degree of stability on the constituency file, my office solves a lot of problems. These are a couple of tricks you sort of do when you're responding to people. They come and they say, should I send it under my name or your name? And so it looks like you have a bit more touch. And during council meetings, you'll see me on the computer. I'm actually going through and surfing through my inbox and sending notes back to people, especially names I'd never seen before that live in the ward. And so you constantly try to do that. But, as I walked, I was with my son this morning, playing some ball hockey, and 3 times had to stop and talk constituency work, right? It's you're in the ward, you're walking through the ward, especially now that you're on your bike and you're cycling through the ward. It's less in the wintertime, but you're just constantly present in all the neighborhoods, and people feel the love. And if they do, it comes back at election time, makes election that much easier because they trust you. And again, they don't trust because of your ideology or your position. They trust you because you're just constantly there, shaking hands, talking to people, fixing what you can get fixed, and you have an office that's consistent and gets the work done. And once you earn that reputation, I don't care whether you're Rob Ford or Adam Vaughan, you're safe in this business when you're talking local politics. And that's why incumbents are so hard to beat.
Well, and not to be facetious.
I'll tell you a story. This is a true story. First day I was canvassing in the first election, and we picked a street up in the north part of the ward because that's where the ward heavily votes in the north part and lightly votes in the south part. And we start walking through a neighborhood that was split last time between the Liberals and the NDP, which is where we did a bunch of analysis to see where the votes might shake. And walking down the street, the very first couple I meet is Bill and Cindy. And Bill stops and goes, "Your old man got my father his building permit for his kitchen. What can I do for you?" And I kid you not, right? And you talk about dumb luck, right? I mean, Bill is Greek. His wife is Portuguese. Immediately had 2 translators. Bill's family's lived in Seton Village for well over 40 years. His family, his mother died when he was very young. The reason it was so important to get the kitchen permit was because the dad had to get a kitchen built so he could take care of the family, and he just was run off his feet. And there was a huge Greek community inside Seton Village. For whatever reason, it's there. And they're largely progressive Greeks that left at a time when Greece was going through some political trouble. So they're all, they're all sort of, they all came out of the labor movement, but we're also immigrants, and we're part of the Trudeau liberal crowd, and so they could go any which way, but they would all go with Bill's family. And that's what I found out very quickly. And when I was running, the federal Liberals, Tony Ayano and Olivia Chow, were still at each other's throats. And Ayano kept coming into the committee room trying to figure out what was going on, and wouldn't give us anything, and wanted everything from us. Wanted to put his photo in the flyers, and had put this here, and have my colors be red, and ... He wanted me to build a machine for him that he could take off and fight Olivia with. And it was a pain in the ass talking to him. But the Liberals, but the NDP all figured it was I was a Liberal. I wasn't, and we canvassed that ward really, really hard. And what seemed to happen was that I flipped the NDP vote, and Bill picked up the Liberal vote, and we walked away with not just that part of the ward, but a couple other key ridings in the ward. Chinatown was another one where we got both the Liberal and the NDP vote in total. And this time around I did it again with over 1,000 votes in that poll. It was huge, huge turnout. But it all came from stopping on the corner street and saying, your old man got me, my father, his kitchen.
Well, and it's interesting.
And that's it.
You're almost implicitly juxtaposing the power of mobilizing social capital with the irrelevance of social media. That on the one hand, you're talking about the way both from a human capital and a social capital perspective, you mapped out the ward and tried to mobilize support to really, and as an aside, showing the potential on the federal level of what could happen if you could actually get those two sides. But yet social media has played no role at all in either your councillor or your campaign. So
yeah,
I mean,
I'm not on Twitter.
When city council seems to be all agog with Twitter, I mean, is it because you feel it's not relevant, or because you feel it's a distraction, or is it just not on the radar?
I'd get into too much trouble. I'm a bit of a smartass, but
it's like the cartoons and illustrations. Better to keep to yourself.
I would get into a lot of trouble. I can be nasty, but I think the other side of it is that while we have Facebook and we cull emails, and we needed to get telephone numbers and contact information and start organizing the condos in the south end of the ward. All very new places. We had buildings that were being populated during the campaign. The voters list was constantly in evolution. I think the rail lands in my first term grew by 436% in population. There's a boom going on in the south end of the ward, if you haven't noticed. And we had no way of reaching these people. They don't have landlines. Right? You can't get into the buildings unless you get permission from the property manager, and even then you need to get the exact person, because you need a fob to get between floors to knock on doors. When you knock on doors, you find out they're all renters, and most of them aren't citizens and can't vote, and so it's a really difficult place to find where support might be. We figured out what the issue was. It was short turning of streetcars on Spadina was driving them nuts, and we could see that there was a huge lineup of people trying to get on the streetcar at Spadina, trying to get to Union Station by going south and then along Queens Quay. And so we started a petition on the streetcar stops to stop the short turning of streetcars at King Street. And we were getting names and addresses by the 60 a morning, which is, you do it for 10 days, you got a list of 600 people. Suddenly you've got a way of phoning into that list, because you had a name, a telephone number, and an email address. We did a telephone poll of like a mechanical poll to find out which way they were heading on the mayoralty race, trying to find out if Rob Ford had a growing vote in this area, because a lot of them are coming from the suburbs, living downtown for the first time, higher income than the average in the ward, and we just wanted to track and figure out what it was. And we were very comfortable to find out that it was about the 22-23% that Ford was polling across the downtown. We didn't need to worry about them so much. And so we could go back to focusing at pulling the vote, which was even lower vote up in the north end of the poll for Ford. It was down about 10-11%. But we knew where the votes were in the ward, and we knew where we were going to deploy resources, because no campaign has enough resources to do a perfect job. And we pulled the vote we thought we needed to pull, but we also knew exactly what we were tracking them and following them and figuring out how to do it. And that's, they say I don't do social media. That doesn't mean I don't use technology to fix problems in a campaign.
Well, and it fits nicely with this notion of big ideas, that you're using substantive ideas that appeal to what people's needs are, i.e. transit, as a data collection mechanism to find out who's there and
like
to find out their attitude.
And the petition technique I stole from the NDP. It's what Olivia Chow does at every single event. She passes around a petition on the issue that you're gathered for. She gets 50 names and addresses, knows what issues matters to them, but more importantly gets 50 email addresses and 50 telephone numbers and goes back at them when she has other issues that she needs to go to. So it was taking a look at the robocalls that Ford was doing, the petitions that the NDP was doing, and one other piece of advice that was given to me was a guy by the name of Bill McMurtry, whose brother was Roy McMurtry, a former cabinet minister with Bill Davis, who was engaged in politics all of his life, who said, when you run for city council, you run for mayor, but you run as a councillor. And so people feel confident, because people engage in city politics, either very, very locally, in which case you deal with those issues, but the majority of voters follow the mayor's race and follow the mayor's race into the ballot box, and they want to hear you speak on the citywide issues. So you've got to always sound like a mayor when you're a city councillor. That puts a target on your back for some, but what it really does is it gives you that ability to pull people in on the larger big city issues.
Now, I've got one more question, although really I've got many. So I certainly encourage those who do have questions to head to the mic to ask your own. I'm curious on that last point, given that there seems to be a turn in City Hall as the council becomes empowered contrary or against the administration. If there's a perception amongst councillors like yourself that the urban progressives need to do more outreach towards suburban voters, that while support for your positions and policies has always been popular in your ward in downtown, there still are the people who voted for Rob Ford, perhaps not even understanding Rob Ford's policy, that arguably, you know, perhaps Miller in his first election was able to get. That would be great if urban progressive councillors were able to, at least in this current term, start showing from a poll perspective that they had that support. Is there any desire, is there any talk amongst how the downtown councillors can win over the suburban Torontonians and win over the people who traditionally have been, I think, voting against their own interest in electing people like Rob Ford, because they want transit, they need transit, and yet they're electing guys who arguably have no concept of how to deliver them transit. So is there any attempt to, as you say, to speak to that larger picture, to speak to that larger Toronto that's beyond just the individual wards, that's beyond the urban progressivism that often the media maligns, but that actually does reflect the majority of Torontonians and what they feel?
I'm not sure I'm comfortable with a lot of the different premises you just propositioned. A couple of things. I mean, you know, the easiest way to beat Rob Ford would be run Doug Ford next election, split the vote, and away we go. But we'll find someone else called Rob Ford and just confuse the silly voters. But I don't think that's going to work. I think that you know, the last poll that came out that Forum Research did, this time around, instead of having John Tory, Shelley Carroll, and Adam Vaughan against Rob Ford, it had Karen Stinson and Adam Vaughan against Rob Ford. I guess I'm flattered that I survived the culling process of the first ballot, but the results were kind of interesting. I mean, I beat Rob Ford in Etobicoke. I don't have to change anything, and I beat Rob Ford in Etobicoke. In fact, during the council debate when Doug Ford was up and it was just going after Gloria Lindsay-Luby about what the people in Etobicoke want, and he knows what the people in Etobicoke, I was behind him heckling them the entire time through his speech, really bothering him, because he gets really...
Which is why we'd all love you on
Which is
Twitter.
why he turned around at one point and said something. But what I was saying is, I know what the people in Etobicoke want. They want me to be the mayor, not your brother. And it was really bugging him. It was, you know, and then he finally turned around and said, bring it on, bring it on. And I said, see, there's somebody else from Etobicoke that wants me to run. And he was just, he just said, he actually kind of enjoys the attention, I think. And he turns around and was laughing. He said, you're the only person who gets me like that. I said, no, not really. You're just not, I'm just happy to be the person behind you, you know. But you know, I beat him in Scarborough. You know, I tied him in the previous poll. I tied him in North York.
But this is my
one
point.
thing is completely inconsistent, though. He's never polled above 17% in downtown Toronto, right across the entire Toronto East York Community Council. So there is a constituency for all of us in every part of the city, whether you're Shelley Carroll or John Tory or Karen Stinson or Adam Vaughan, and it's extraordinarily competitive with Rob Ford. It's weak in a few areas. It's weak amongst folks who are 60 and older. It's weak amongst people earning between $40,000 and $60,000 a year, which is interesting. That's the group that votes, I think, consistently against their self-interest. I think they assume that they're doing better and don't understand why they're falling behind, and it's the disappearing middle class in the post-war suburbs, if you can call them that or outside the old city of Toronto that are feeling that, but they feel it in the inside of the city as well, and in Riverdale and neighborhoods like this. But there are a couple of constituencies where we absolutely lose it. And we lose it amongst hardcore conservative voters, which I wouldn't expect to ever convert, no matter where they lived, no matter how close to the university they might reside. So there are. You look at it and you go, okay, how do you marshal the votes to win? And the way you marshal the votes to win is that you know that you've got all those other demographics that lie outside of that. So you've got to do a couple of things. One, the people earning below $40,000, if you can call them in sort of what they're normally referred to as the poor, or the economically marginalized if you went to university. But if you think about that group, largely single mothers, predominantly people of color, a substantial component are recent citizens who are, like families like mine, immigrants who are just starting to make their way in this city, young students, young people, and artists coming right out of school or starting their careers. That's the group that votes the least, most likely to be tenants as well. That's the group that votes the least. But a longtime mentor of mine, a very good friend who I met through CKLN, Norman Otis Richmond, embedded a thought in my head a long time ago, and it's true. If the poor voted, they wouldn't be poor. They'd be the government. And that changes everything. And that's the crowd that if they ever came out to vote and voted in their self-interest for candidates that represented or even reflected who they were as a social class, as a political class, they would take over the city so quick and so fast. They would take over Queen's Park, they would take over Ottawa, they'd take over the United Nations. But they don't vote. And they're convinced by a lot of the residual or the sort of the easy media to get your hands on, whether it's the Sun or the internet or the talk radio, that voting doesn't matter, that all politicians are the same, that everyone, you look at the Toronto Sun today on Regent Park, it's the most, she spent a month putting that story together. She went and read the MPAC rules and found out that people at TCHC bought market units as investments. Wow, what a shocker. What a shocker. Condos for sale and someone bought it. 5 people out of 700, 800 condominiums that were sold, 5 people were tied to the project. 5 people who had faith in the project went into a condo store and purchased a condo. Groundbreaking. Just shocking. Right? That's amazing. But it kind of brings up your point. But there's a disconnect between empirical reality and media reality. The goal is to make folks in TCHC go, they got the best unit. I'm living with a hole in the wall. We are fixing the entire neighborhood, and we are remixing the neighborhood so you don't end up with situations like we had in Florida where a kid walking home gets shot by a vigilante who's afraid of his neighbors. Regent Park was built at a time and built in a way and built for a reason. Those reasons and those times and that reality doesn't exist anymore. We need integrated neighborhoods. Should the buildings themselves be integrated? Watch Alex Park. They will be. Are we going to displace people from Alex Park? No, the folks in Alex Park learned from Regent Park. As one young man said early in the process, if you're going to fix the neighborhood, don't break the community. Don't break my neighborhood. Fix the community. And so, but we almost push, we make it difficult for people in low-income communities to vote. They get the addresses wrong in Alex Park all the time. The voters list is terrible in Alex Park. TCHC does a horrible job of enumerating its residents and then wonders why they don't show up at the ballot box and takes no responsibility for it. We have a media that basically gravitates to money politics, not to popular politics. And we have political institutions and political candidates and progressive parties that haven't gone out and done the voter education and haven't gone out and done the voter enrollment and delivered people to the polls and really engaged those communities in a culture of political change. And as a result, I know and everyone else knows, if you build a park in the annex, you get 1,000 votes. You build a park in Alex Park, you've built a park in Alex Park. But it doesn't translate into political activism unless you engage the people in Alex Park and show them how their voice and their action and their participation and their role in the process fixes the park, and therefore it fixes their lives, and therefore there is a value to political activism because change is possible. And when you start doing that, you take care of the below 40,000 group, and that area is rich in votes. Then you marry that with the progressive ideals of more affluent parts of the city and communities with a stronger tradition of voting, and the mayor's race is easy to win with 10 or 15 candidates in the race. But you've got to do that work. You can't take it for granted.
Questions, comments, anecdotes. I can continue to talk to the councillor for the entire afternoon. So, King, you look like you're ready to step up. Notebook in hand.
So, what are you really doing to get through to the minorities? Because, like you're saying, like if the minorities voted, it would make a difference. But are you going there and showing them, like, look, these are the statistics, and you guys are lacking, and if you guys were to actually go out and vote, like, this is the difference that it would actually make? Because I find it like...
First of all, what's your name?
King.
Kane?
King.
King. And what neighborhood are you from?
No, now I live in Scarborough.
No worries. But which neighborhood?
Oh, I used to live on Dufferin and Davenport, Malvern, like all over. Born in Rexdale, so like...
Yeah. Well, you can run anywhere. Yeah, no, I spend a lot of time in TCHC communities and low-income communities in the ward. I think I think there's something wrong with the way we do politics in Toronto. I don't think we spend enough time there. I spend more time in Alex Park than any other neighborhood in the ward, and every time I come to an organization like this, or go into the annex, or go anywhere else, I tell them that's the priority. Until Alex Park is happy, I'm not happy, and if I'm not happy, I'm not a very good councillor for you. And so you've got to help me make Alex Park happy, so what are you going to do to help? And it's about making it a priority. And when we're in Alex Park, it's not about saying, oh, you poor folks, you let a good councillor like me who lives around the corner come here and change your lives. It's you've got to change your lives. TCHC doesn't care. City Hall doesn't care. You've had elections after elections here where they've come here looking for your votes, and nothing's changed. So we're going to change the neighborhood. Right? And we're going to start work on that now. And it was the first thing we did right after the very first election. We never asked TCHC to be revitalized. We just started talking about the fact it was going to happen, with or without TCHC. They came on board. We never asked City Hall to come in and do planning studies. We just started making propositions to council, and planning got engaged. And piece by piece, dollar by dollar, program by program, folks at Alex Park realized that if they got organized and they asked and they did things, City Hall would have to respond. And as a result, Alex Park went from being not even on the list for revitalized communities to being in a position where it's the next place the shovel goes in the ground in this city. And who's leading it? The person who leads that process, who's in charge of the visioning committee, is someone who, when it started, was 17 years old and just coming out of high school, and she's now graduated with a planning degree, and she's working in social justice in another organization in the city. Marwa El-Dadiri is the person who's doing all of that, and she's the person who, if the community has a problem, they go to her because they know she can make change happen at City Hall. And she now comes down and talks about the library system being shut down. She talks about the community centers being funded properly. She talked about the transit to Scarborough and to other parts of Etobicoke and North York, because she knows through her network of friends, and she's more than just an Alex Park rep, and more than just a Ryerson grad, she's also very engaged in the Muslim community, and she knows that the Muslim community out in Rexdale is not getting transit. And if they want to get to mosque and get to school and be part of the Muslim Student Association at Ryerson and need to get home to get to work or to take care of a relative, that they need transit. And so she comes up and she says, look, I'm from downtown Toronto and I want LRT in Rexdale. It's got to get there now. That's what I need to make my world work. And so it's a constant process of looking for those people who are natural leaders within their community. And when they're upset, you respond to it. When they're happy, you give them something else to do. And you just keep working with them and keep getting them to achieve things. When a bunch of 20-year-old students took over the co-op board at Alex Park, kicked all the adults out, and took over because they're the ones in university with all the skill sets required to run a property. Engineers, accountants, planners, architects, social work, the whole bit. They're all in their 20s. When they took it over, the first thing I took the board chair aside and I said, you need a quick win. What's the number one priority for this neighborhood? They said, well, actually, the tractor that clears the snow and picks up the garbage is just busted. We need a new one. Done. We're going to make you deliver. You just keep delivering. You tell me what you need, and I'll keep making it look like you've delivered. You take all the credit. Do it. And become strong, become powerful, become a leader, become effective. And then tell me who the next kid coming up is, because we'll make that kid strong and powerful and effective, and I'll have a neighborhood full of strong, powerful, effective people. I don't have to worry if it's TCHC or not. You've got good, strong leadership in your neighborhood. And part of the revitalization of Alex Park is to make sure that that group, which have their university degrees and will all be working in professions in the city within a couple of years, will be too affluent to live in Alex Park. Is that one of the reasons we're redeveloping Alex Park is to put affluent housing there, so that generation of leaders doesn't have to leave the neighborhood. So we expand the capacity of the neighborhood to lead, but we also expand the capacity of the neighborhood to house its leaders who become successful people. And that builds a strong neighborhood. And at some point, I really expect someone from Alex Park to be the next ward councillor. I hope so.
Next question.
Let me get this. Oh, I'm just going to stand on my tiptoes. So I'm just going to preface this by saying I'm from Fort Mac, and I went to school in university in Calgary. Why are the
Fort Mac?
Murray, Alberta.
Oh, gotcha.
Sorry. Yeah. So yeah, I'm from the oil sands, I guess. But it's so strange to me see this crazy divide between the downtowns and the suburbs.
It's a fictional divide.
It seems like that to me, but
it's a media divide, though. I think is the. but I think the issue though is it is a media divide that is repeated over and over and over.
It's like the West and the rest of Canada.
Exactly.
The politics of grievance is very powerful.
And the politics of envy, because this whole LRT subways debate is absurd. I rode LRT every day in Calgary, and it doesn't stop when it snows.
But you're all communists out in Calgary. Come on.
Yeah, we really are. I mean, yeah.
And we know that Calgary's a lot warmer because of climate change now than Toronto ever was. But no, look, it's easy to create a division. You know, and sometimes in politics, you play that. You know, you sort of, you know, right after Christmas, we started calling Ford's team the Radical Conservatives. They have this radical conservative agenda.
Yeah.
We actually had a sport. We had a competition going. Who could get it in the newspaper the most times, right? And everyone thought we were absolutely nuts, right? The left thought we were crazy. The right thought we were crazy. You know, the newspapers were aware of it and they thought we were crazy, yet they were still doing it, which is really kind of interesting. But what we wanted to do was we wanted to divide the conservatives in two. And people, I'm not a radical. I'm a fiscal conservative. I'm not a radical conservative. I said, you know, you tell me. You know, you show me how different you are. No, I'm not. I'm not like Rob Ford. Your voting record's exactly like Rob Ford's. You're a radical conservative too, and that split the executive. Split the executive. And everyone thought we were being mean and pejorative. And it was a silly term, and there were doubters who were sort of tentatively into the game. I think at one point Mike Layton was radical conservative. It was radical. No, it was right-wing conservative agenda, and it was like, no, sorry, Mike, that's not good enough. You'll get no points for that. It's got to be radical conservative. But I want to own the word radical. I said, you got to give them the word radical. So when you say there's a split between someone in Malvern waiting for transit and somebody on a streetcar platform at City Place waiting for transit, I can tell you that the aggravation and the wait and being late for work gives you the same anxiety, whether it's a half an hour or 10 minutes, whether you're north or south of Eglinton, east or west of Yonge Street. What you're talking about is people who use transit who aren't getting to work. And that frustration is universal across the city for all folks who use transit. Who uses transit? And what's interesting about that is that while there's a higher usage in the downtown, therefore people in the downtown are called bike riding pinkos, hence my bicycle, and fewer people in the suburbs, in neighborhoods designed by and for car use or can use transit, there are fewer transit users in the suburbs. But when you appeal to transit users in the suburbs, you've got their vote. The folks along Finch know who delivered transit and I ordered transit to them. And it's not a downtown suburban issue. It's a transit use issue. It's part of the group which is economically marginalized and physically marginalized in our city into the post-war suburbs that are now starting to sink because because of a whole series of socioeconomic dynamics. When you start talking about where's your library, where's your community center, where's your ride, where's your daycare? You're talking about issues which aren't suburban and downtown. They're the issues that we exist on and the issues that City Hall deals with. And there is a way of getting out to those communities and creating change. You know, why do the folks in Rexdale keep electing Doug Ford and Rob Ford? And he shows up at the housing project and shouts at the hole in the wall and leaves. He doesn't actually get it fixed. And at some point, someone's going to realize that he's really good at screaming at the hole in the wall. He's really bad at funding the housing corporation to get it fixed. And that's what's going to unite us. Is that you know I can shout at a hole in the wall too, but I'm actually better at getting them fixed. And that brings them across, not as a downtown or a suburban, tenant to TCHC. They want to live in better housing. I want better housing too. I just want better housing. I want beautiful housing in TCH. I want TCHC to be the best housing in the city. I want folks to be looking at Regent Park and saying, how come I can't live there? And saying, well, you can, but how come we can't build Regent Park in Thistletown or Rexdale or Malvern or Morningside Heights? Why can't all those public housing projects be examples of great, great city building? And when you talk about it that way, the folks out in Malvern are on side. There ain't no downtown suburban split with them.
Romeo?
Let's see. We've had long-standing issues with mayors who engage in rather odd confrontation, odd habit of confrontation and alienating large segments of the population. Like we've had Mel Lastman. Well, you've had your own rather odd issues with confrontation with him before and after going into politics. And now we have Rod Ford, whose bizarre decision to pass on attending Pride Day last year, and who may very well do the same thing this year. And other politicians like George Mammoliti, whose main contribution to Pride Day involved going around with a video camera. So how are we what are we make of this strange policy of confrontation and alienation?
Well, I think if you look at it historically, what you'll see is an interesting pattern. I think if you go back to, say, Bill Dennis in 1969, who was a CCFer who supported the Spadina Expressway and was into blockbusting and the whole kit and caboodle, but nonetheless a New Democrat. He was and didn't like citizens groups and thought they were all just, phony baloney, couple of, troublemakers, not really a broad-based organization. If you take a look at it and go through the history of mayors that have occupied Nathan Phillips Square, you go Bill Dennison, and you go David Crombie, you go John Sewell, you go Art Eggleton, you go June Rowlands, you go Barbara Hall, you go Mel Lastman, you go David Miller, you get to Rob Ford. And I don't think it's so much right-left or so much confrontationalist, although it's part of it. I think what it is it's competency that is then followed by sort of character. Competency, character, competency, character. And so Crombie, Bill Dennison was a bit of a character. Before that, it was Phil Gibbons, who was extraordinarily competent. So competent, character. Crombie's competent. Sewell's a character. Eggleton is competent. Right? It goes on back and forth like that. And it more or less, that's the actual sort of yin and yang of it all, and flip and flop of it all, which is good news because it means the next person is going to be a bit more competent than the character. The question is, are they going to be a progressive competent or a middle of the road competent? Or even a right-wing competent, I'd take at this point. But but that's the real dynamic that sits in front of it. But I'll proposition you something differently, because I know that my name in the mayor's race gets mentioned a lot. I actually think the most important political reform we could achieve in the city is to have no mayor. I think it's the competing mandates, and it's the sort of citywide, quote-unquote, vision thing that quite often is what gets in the way of us building better neighborhoods. If you take a look at the way in which council is currently operating right now, it's in spite of the mayor. There's no guidance from someone with a citywide mandate. There's no mayor's office pulling levers or making things happen. What you have is between 25 and getting closer to 35, and it's really like 28 and 35 now. Councillors sitting down saying, how do we make this work? What do you need to get done? This is what I got to get done. This is what I'm trying to do. What are you trying to do? How do we make sure we don't step on each other's toes and just make sure it gets through council? And I think you're going to start to see in the next 2.5 years, and I'm glad we didn't expect Ford to be in this position until well after their second year. We're ahead of schedule on it. No, we sat down after the election and we could see where it was going to go. It was Ford's Ford. We all worked around him for 10 years. But we're in a position now where we have about 2.5 years to actually get stuff done, which is good news. And it makes the next mayor's race less critical than making the next set of council races more interesting. If we could get that number between 35 and 40, the creativity would become even more ambitious and even more daring and even more locally centered into making really spectacular things happen in people's communities. And that's where you get the region parks being transformed. It's where you get the priority neighborhood programs that deliver services and resources to communities that have been denied those opportunities. It's where you start building higher orders of transit in areas that could really use the investment combined with the opportunity. And so that's where I think the next conversation really needs to be focused. It's not so much about the mayor's race for me. It's about getting 5 or 6 councillors who really aren't doing anything. I mean, they'll stand up in council and say, my ward has nothing. My ward's got no transit. It's got no community centers. I've got no libraries in my ward. The parks never get fixed in my ward. Look at the potholes in my ward. The TCHC properties stink in my ward. You go, what kind of a councillor have they elected? Like, that's what a councillor does. They fix those things. And to sit around and saying, I got nothing in my ward after 15 or 20 years of being the councillor? At what point do the residents go, you're right, let's get someone who can get some stuff done around here elected? And so there are a bunch of folks who make that speech endlessly at council. Endlessly at council. And those are the folks that I'm more interested in getting rid of. And compared to them, Rob Ford actually looks competent. But when, and Frances Nunziata, I'll name one of them. She doesn't get anything done. Anything. And now she's inside the mayor's office on a regular basis, getting rides home from Doug Ford. She still doesn't get anything done. Like, when do her residents stop and go, you know what? She feels our pain, but she ain't healing anything. And I think that's to me is the change that's required, and the change that I'm interested in working towards in the next election.
We've got 3 people in line. Anyone else who'd like to ask a question, now would be a good time to stand up to ensure that you're accommodated. Addy.
Adam, hey, I live actually right by OCAD, and thank you very much for paying attention to a thinker like Norman Otis Richmond, because that's a voice that needs to be broadcast way wider in this city.
I've got other quotes from him too.
You share them anywhere. As an artist I've worked, in multiple capacities in the music industry in Toronto since I came here in '96 from Ottawa, but I was born here. I've always felt like it's been the most insane struggle to survive off artistry in Toronto. So many people on one hand are saying you've done this and that, and you can give a lot, and you can do an open mic on Queen Street for 5 years, or you can come to a beautiful place like this for 4 years and just give where you can actually fit in. But I know the opportunities for the artists in such a diverse, ridiculously rich cultural city like Toronto, I can tell you countless artists. This beautiful singer I know working at David's Tea down on Queen Street, who when she wants to, she can go to Europe and tour 10, 15 cities, but she comes back here and she's just struggling to get any opportunities, whether it's once a year at the Harbourfront or anything that would sustain her as a Canadian musician. And just from somebody who sees right through the matrix, bullshit, lies, politics game and actually has a heart, I was wondering, what kind of advice do you have for artists in this day and age dealing with an administration like Rob Ford, who did something insane threatened to remove graffiti from a city that's leading the world in so many levels of visual art?
Well, I think it's important to note that one of the turning points was when he attacked culture, when he attacked the libraries. It's when things started to turn. I would say that it started to unravel probably with Pride, but it became unhinged with the libraries and move forward from there. And everyone credits Margaret Atwood with a lot of praise, and gives her a lot of praise for what happened. It was really the 14-year-old kid from North Scarborough who came and broke down in tears, saying, "Where am I going to do my homework?" At about 3 o'clock in the morning. That everyone stepped back and went, "All right, this is going too far, right?" That's what's the impact is. And here's a kid who's off to the races as soon as she can get into university, but we're actually making it tougher for her, and there's no reason to do that. And she's here. And I think that was actually one of the most important speeches that was presented at City Council. And it was a kid demanding access to culture. Whether she becomes a doctor or a lawyer or a musician afterwards, her access to books and to literature and to the cultural institution that the library represents was critical. Artists have a huge role to play in leading and shaping and creating the messaging that's going to get folks elected and is going to get change happening in the city. The artists are the most important asset, in my perspective, that the left wing has over everything else that the right wing employs. It's our counterpoint to their corporate structure, because the creativity of the artist, and this is from Norman as well, who often said that the culture of the poor becomes the business of the rich. Right? The asset that Africa has never surrendered is its ability to generate culture. It's music, it's dance, it's visual arts. It's never been sacrificed. It's the natural resource which they can't mine. But they do exploit, and they do pick up and transform. We used to do hip hop at CKLN. The engineers tried to close us down, and then at the end we weren't playing hip hop, so the engineers tried to close us down. but it's just the way things change. So when you take a look at graffiti artists and the role they've played in creating the visual message that Rob Ford's not popular for everyone to look at, when you take a look at in particular the humor that artists employ in tackling it, whether it's the videos or it's the slogans or the buttons or the presentations, the performance art at council and at committee rooms have been absolutely spectacular. Spacing Magazine, all of these groups that are just constantly out there, constantly advocating on the stages across the city. Whether it's a comedy show or a theater or what have you, at art openings, there's a constant conversation about how this city isn't working for folks. And artists, when they talk about it, they don't talk about arts funding. And sometimes they do, and that's part of the conversation. But artists are economically marginalized until they're profoundly successful, and then they're in the 1%. They go from 0 to 1 quicker than anyone, but they take a long time to get there sometimes.
Amen.
But and it's where I start. I start in a warehouse like this too. So I understand. It's kind of it's part of the reason maybe why I see it so clearly this way. But artists have to get involved. You know, you cannot rely on corporate donations to fuel the next election campaign. However, social media and the visual arts and graffiti and all these things that the arts community has complete and total, you know, almost control over, monopoly over, are what's going to take to change this city. And when they do, and when artists get progressive politicians elected, and they're very good at it, artist housing gets built. Right? The resources needed from space like this through to resources to OCAD gets delivered. We've worked in the ward to deliver close to 20,000 square feet of non-profit commercial space as part of new condominium development, largely in 500 square foot increments, which is about half the size of this room, to get them into the hands of the Arts Council, but we're also in the 5,000 and 8,000 square foot range as well, to deliver space to artists. But artists need daycare, artists need transit. You know, artists need the library system and all those other things to make their work relevant, and they need as well fresh arts programs beginning that mine, you know, north of Etobicoke and south Scarborough and in the middle of the old city of York. They need to get kids. You know, they get employed teaching kids about culture. You know, I'm a parent. You know, I got an 8-year-old and a 14-year-old. My 8-year-old will play soccer or hockey 28 hours a day and doesn't have to be motivated to do it. I just have to keep finding him teams to join. My 14-year-old wants to sing, right? wants to be in, you know, in theater. She reads books endlessly. For her, it's culture. The average kid, if you look at them, is motivated to do one or two different things in life: sport or culture. Yeah, they want to be a superstar athlete or a superstar cultural icon, right? And they're highly motivated to do that. And they all have a dream that they follow endlessly to get there. Even if they don't get there, even if they just become the person who changes costumes, or who writes the sports story, or who you know, creates the new hockey blade that everyone skates on, or does whatever they do. I mean, you know, I thought I might be an actor. I ended up being a cartoonist. I don't know how it happened, and now I do performance art at City Hall, but which is much better paying than cartooning. But it's the thing is that when we create opportunities for young people inside priority neighborhoods and at community centers and after-school programs, 9 times out of 10, we're employing an artist to teach young kids about the skills they've acquired, whether it's graffiti, hip-hop, recording, dance, theater, writing, whatever it is. And so when you start to package around all the things that progressive politics in the city has delivered historically in Toronto, housing, transit, cultural, after-school, childcare, you name it, even seniors programs, what you find is that artists start to do better. But if we don't create space for artists to do what they need to do, and that's where the nonprofit commercial space comes in, it's just a lot of better paid artists struggling. And what we still need are the stages and the rehearsal spaces and the galleries, and that's part of the work we have to do at City Hall. But that's a program that shows you where artists get paid off for their engagement, where they make their investment to get that payoff delivered, and how they have to be tied into the political process. So you may be a great singer, and you may be able to host a fundraiser for a candidate who's a great public speaker, and that public speaker may need someone who's got some theater experience to stage their events so that those events actually have some punch and some carriage. And you may need a good graphic artist who may not be the painter you know, but is the painter's friend that went to OCAD that knows how to do graphic design real quick and real cheap. All of those things, all of those networks that the arts community brings to politics are so critically important to getting better, smarter, more creative politicians elected. And when you do that, your life as an artist will be better.
Thank you.
No worries.
Keep fighting the good fight.
So logistically, we've got 4 people, Adil, and then over there, and then 2, ending with David. So that's the speakers list cut off. My moderation style is usually based on my ADHD, and the counselor has been very entertaining that my ADHD has not kicked in. But we do have an event here at 4 o'clock. Ed Keenan's writing as a business course, so we do have a very hard deadline of when we want to end. So we'll cut off the speakers list at this 4 unless anyone right now really wants to show any pressing desire. So no, Adil.
Okay, I'm from Rexdale, and we had the lowest voter turnout in all of Toronto and in all elections.
And you had Khadija Ali to vote for.
Pardon?
And you had Khadija Ali to vote for, and she's great.
I wasn't in the country, but and besides, I don't pay attention to city politics. But no, my question is, I get why most marginalized people don't vote. You know, they don't have the time. When I look at my community, most people get home at 7 o'clock if they're lucky, and then by then they have to cook dinner and, you know, help the children. So they don't have time to go vote. And for them to go vote is really to go out of their way or make an economic sacrifice by not doing a shift maybe to vote. And for them to do that, you really have to provide leadership that speaks their language, right? But then I find that in a way the system prevents people like me, for instance, if I did want to be a candidate, to become successful at that. For instance, to be a candidate, you have to own or lease property. It is one of the criteria on the website. No?
No.
Okay, well, it is there. But if not that, the whole idea that you need money, that most people who are struggling cannot afford to take 8 months to campaign and not work. So I just wanted to know, what are you doing to change the system to make it more accessible to marginalized people, like maybe changing the voting day to a Saturday so that more people can vote, or making politics more interesting for people in North Etobicoke who cannot, you know, afford to travel all the way to City Hall to do a deputation or to take part in that way.
We had a really interesting moment at council this week when the chair of the expert panel was in Peru and couldn't be present for questions from council, and they Skyped him in. It was quite interesting. It was the first time we'd ever had questions and answers through technology for an expert who, in this case, had been charged by council to report to us, but you know, had to earn his own living and therefore had to be where he had to be. And it was I hope, a game changer. You know, if you're right now, if you're a city councilor like Ron Moser, who's been sick for the better part of the last 8 months and had some pretty serious surgery and some pretty difficult things to overcome, he hasn't been able to be present for most of the council meetings, and therefore his ward isn't getting the vote counted. And that's not, you know, it helped us in one vote. It almost hurt us this time because he changed sides. But nonetheless, we have technology available to us now that should allow us to get past sort of a Victorian-styled, and what by Victorian I mean like 2 centuries ago, style set of political rules. I mean, you know, even the term riding, which comes from how far you could ride a horse in a day, should tell you how crazy we are. So there are a number of things. First of all, don't reduce the size of council. You reduce the size of council, you're going to entrench powerful interests. You know, the bigger the ward, the more money it takes, the more time it takes. The smaller the ward, the less money it takes, the less time it takes, and therefore the more vulnerable sitting politicians are. I would advocate doubling the size of council to 88, not cutting it to 22. I've always, and as I said already, I would lean more towards a parliamentary system and less a congressional system, and I would have the mayor elected by those 88 people. I think that's critical. I also think that there's things like the Parks body, the Parks Department, and the Library Board should actually be directly elected, as should the Transit Commission. I think we need to broaden the base of democracy in the city. When the Harris Tories reduced us from 107 to 56 down to 44, accountability and change became harder and harder to realize or enunciate, and political powers became more entrenched in the political class and less in the neighborhood, and that's been a very bad thing. I think that reform of the funding system, I think that you shouldn't be able to raise money, and I was very successful at raising money, but I don't raise money from any corporation. I don't raise it from anybody who's the lobbyist at City Hall. I don't take any money from a developer, and I post every one of my donations in real time on the website, including in different categories, 500 to 750, 200 to 500, 100 to 200, below 100. I believe in that transparency. I've done it for both elections, but I actually think you shouldn't be allowed to raise money outside your ward. I think that would also start to localize the power base that you have to represent and respond to in order to be a city councillor. I do agree with you on voting reform. I think it should be over the weekend. I don't think there's any reason whatsoever. If we can run advanced polls across the city every weekend before the vote, why can't we open up everybody's polling station for 3 days and get everyone's vote to come in? Why can't we use technology to vote? I mean, I was in El Salvador to watch their election. They have a better voting system than we do, and they've barely begun to experiment with democracy. And what's wrong with dipping your thumb in a die to show that you voted, so you cut down on voter fraud? It also becomes, and I've seen it, a badge of honor. I have voted. I've seen it in South Africa. I've seen it in El Salvador. I've seen it in Chile. It becomes a very powerful mark that you participated. Where's your purple thumb? Why haven't you voted? People start to stop folks on the street and say, go and vote. It's good. It's a good thing. You can't lie about it. You either you did or you didn't. So there are things that need to happen. But part of it, I think, is if you don't make politicians vulnerable all the time, you make them powerful almost all of the time. And so that's the way to change it. A smaller ward in North Etobicoke, no outside money, multiple days of voting, and all of a sudden, and getting rid of entrenched interests, and you're off to the races. In fact, drop the maximum donation. Here's another one that no one ever talks about. If you're a mother of 4, you get 5 votes. Think about what that would change in the city overnight. How hard would it be to cut children's services if the advocates of children, the parents, had carried their votes with them until they're 18? Mm-hmm. Would you touch a library? Would you close a child care center? You wouldn't touch them.
Certainly get a lot more women elected too, I suspect.
You would get, but this is actually really serious. And I think this is when we talk about the next election, this is really serious. If we, instead of trying to become a world-class city, whatever that means, and the pursuit of a casino is as emblematic of that, is about as bizarre as thing I've ever heard. Go to Barcelona, the ugliest building in the city, I kid you not, is a casino. In a city of great architecture, a world-class city, it is on the waterfront and no one is there. You go to every other part of Barcelona, it's beautiful, it's jam full of people, it's got social vibrancy, it's got world-class status in terms of being recognized around the globe. But the one thing that's supposed to be giving you world-class status, the casino, is a mere afterthought, and it eats up beautiful space on a wonderful beach. It's quite amazing. The only thing that's at all endearing about it is this beautiful Frank Gehry sculpture in front of it. If it wasn't for that, I never would have found it. But think about a city that decided to become the greatest city in the world to be a kid. Think of what that would entail. Right? Free transit, libraries open all the time, community centers full of programs that engage you culturally and athletically. Think about housing for kids and housing for families and the support that we can provide through our tax base for a better educational system. Make our kids smarter and healthier, more imagination, but just happier alone. Think of what that would do to the city in 10 years, in 20 years. You wouldn't have this concept of Harris's kids lining up to get into prison programs. Right? You wouldn't have that. What you'd have is some of the most creative, amazing citizens being incubated in this city and transforming overnight the social outcomes and the economic outcomes of Toronto. People will be flocking to the city to look at these beautiful children. And when you think of it this way, this is not about being a parent and about having kids and all that sort of stuff. It's also making sure that the choices that kids make them stronger and better and smarter and happier as well. And that means that as a center for the gay and lesbian community, which may not see itself in this role primarily, they too would have a role in making their kids happy, because they knew as kids they weren't happy. It would change this city forever. And I think it would change politics forever. And I don't think it would be described as left or right, or downtown or suburb. I don't think it would be intergenerational in the way that's usually used. I think the one thing you can get out of a grandparent is empathy and support for a grandchild. It brings out the best in us because it brings out our support for the other. And if we could create a politics around the child in the city, it would universalize all that's good about humanity in a minute, and we would walk away with the next election. And that comes from that idea of electoral reform. Give kids the vote, but only if their parents bring them to the polling station. It'll be a family conversation about who you're voting for. Kids will know which candidate. Kids know which candidate is good for kids. They get it. They have a natural sense of that justice. That's what I think we ought to be focusing on, and that is where I think electoral reform could really change the world.
Let us overthrow the gerontocracy. But first, 3 last questions.
My name is Rowan and I live in this ward, and you were talking earlier about the organic process that is canvassing, but also about big ideas. And I was wondering if you could just speak to the idea of the platform in municipal politics. Okay, I'm not sure if it exists. It exists less so now in federal and provincial politics, so whether it ever existed here at the municipal level, I don't know. But somewhere between a mandate and a campaign promise and the motions that end up on the floor, and plans like Councillor Milchan's Bolder and Brighter plan, somewhere in that mix might be the idea of a platform, and might be something that could be...
I missed Milchan's which plan?
Bolder and Brighter
Oh,
plan.
right. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
You can discuss the name as much
Yeah,
as you
no,
like.
it's a planning document that talked about family housing. Yeah, yeah. I had heard about that somewhere before. I just couldn't remember where. Cultural space be invested in the podium's ability. It was a very funny document. Anyway, sorry.
The idea of the platform at the municipal level, is it something that councillors could subscribe to, or that anyone would want to?
Great ideas create great campaigns. Right? I mean, people are drawn not so much just to good candidates, but to good ideas. And so having a collection of good ideas, a very focused sort of package of good ideas you're going to work on as a proposition is invaluable if you're going to run a campaign. That being said, and then you could probably package up the notion of building the greatest city in the world to be a kid as a platform and as a campaign. You could start taking a look at the different policy intersections there and put together a sort of a platform or election sort of pledge very, very quickly. But if you look at what Vision did in Vancouver, as an example, one of the things they did is they started to organize themselves as a new political party in a very polarized political environment between COPE and the NPA. Vision sort of came up the middle and out of nowhere took over and has now won electoral success in 2 consecutive elections. They have a progressive mayor, a progressive council with a good sort of mix of representation on it, and it's a different political climate, so it's not entirely fair to compare it to Toronto. But one of the things they started doing was building their base before they became a big, strong political party with candidates' names. They ran bike workshops in everyone's neighborhoods. Right? They looked at what they had as a group of talents and a group of needs in the city, and they taught people how to fix their bikes. They also got the unions and tradespeople involved, and they would take, and a lot of the homes in Vancouver, like Toronto, the neighborhoods sort of were all built out at a time, and they all have the same sorts of deficiencies around energy efficiency. And what they did was they would take a senior citizen's home, and they would completely winterize it and make it energy efficient. And in doing so, hold workshops for the street to show how this is how you weather strip a window, this is how you clean your ducts, this is how you fix your gutters, this is how you make your water heater more efficient. And they would do all these little tiny things and teach people how to fix their own homes and also build a network of people who are interested in making Vancouver a green city. They did these things on a pod-by-pod basis, and so people were coming there to find out how to make their house, save a couple of bucks on the heating bill. But what they were really being brought into is a conversation about why we should have municipal programs to make this more universal. How do we institutionalize this? What's your name? What are the other issues in your life? Let me come to your house and take a look at that heater. Oh, I noticed here you've got an elderly patient, an elderly parent. Do you know we can get a Meals on Wheels program started in this neighborhood if we had 6 more? And they started to grow from those 2 very simple things: winterizing your house, fixing your bicycle, a group of progressive interests that have left them in a position where they run with an amazing amount of social media, an amazing amount of political organizing on top of that, and a good candidate. And they've built a political platform in that city which straddles the progressive divides that normally defeat us, and are leading the way with some of the best urban thinking in the country right now.
Right on. Second last question.
Hello, Councillor Vaughan. My name is Corey, and I have a question about the
You have to tell me which neighborhood you live in first.
Pardon me?
Which neighborhood you live in?
Oh, I live in Ward 19.
That's not a neighborhood.
Yeah.
Where do you hail from?
Where do I hail from?
Yeah, Ward 19.
Closest
What's the name of the neighborhood?
Well,
in Ward 19?
I want people
I live
to
on
start.
Beatrice Street near College and Grace.
You're in
Halfway right in between College and
You're in the
Dundas.
Trinity Bellwoods neighborhood.
Trinity Bellwoods, yes, and loving it. Can't complain.
I do this for a reason, though, because I want people to start thinking differently about how they label themselves. Because when you say Ward 19,
Yeah.
the rest, I don't know which count. I know Ward 19 because it's Mike Layton. It's
Yeah.
the ward I live in. But the numbers of the councils, when I hear Ward 43, I don't know who you're talking about. I kind of know it's in Scarborough, but I have no idea who it is. When I hear Malvern, I know exactly who it is. It's
Right.
Raymond
No, I
Sheldon.
identify with Bellwoods, definitely.
Okay, there you go.
Or Dundas West, if you
There
want
you
to call
go.
that.
That's good.
A neighborhood.
Those work for me.
Okay, great.
Now that negotiation has been settled.
No, but seriously, you all need to think that way, because it's a stronger political name than 19.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so I've been engaged in City Hall politics for the past 2 years, and very active on social media. And I work in the media. I actually work for TVO. So I have a question about journalism at City Hall. You
Sure.
mentioned earlier that at City Hall, the media tends to focus on money politics, not popular politics.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, has that always been the case? What is your view of the shift of the focus of the media at City Hall over the time that you've been there? And who are the real journalists at City Hall? And if you have any favorite journalists at City Hall?
No.
I knew the answer.
No, it's not true. I don't think I've ever seen a press gallery there with less institutional memory. Beyond Paul Maloney, I don't think anyone was there when Mel Lastman was there. Royce and James and Sue Ann Levy notwithstanding. But the bulk of, when I was covering it for the CBC on television, I was there full-time for CBC. My dad was there full-time for City. CP24 didn't exist at that point. It was just starting to exist. CFTO had their own reporter. Global had their own reporter. And TVO used to have their own reporter. That was 5 full-time television reporters, and every one of the newspapers had at least 5 people. That's another 15. And every one of them had been around City Hall since, at least had one person on staff from at least the 60s. 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 40 years of political history. And they also covered Metro Hall with almost the same deployment, except for television covered off on both. So nowadays, the Globe Mail's down to 3, the Sun is down to 1 and a bit, and sorry, I'm having fun now.
Well, Don Pete does
I'm only doing this because I know it's on YouTube, and she's going to get really upset if I remember her name.
She,
is it a she? Yeah, I think it is.
we won't go there, but we've received some tweets from that individual
I'm sure,
already.
yeah, and she has avatars. She tweets as like 3 or 4 different people. She doesn't. She spends so much time tweeting. Thankfully, she doesn't have to write anymore. But and this, and you've got a couple people for the National Post and Globe. It's a much smaller press gallery. It's a much less engaged press gallery. They when I ran, I think there was only one member of the press gallery who thought I would win. And I remember coming in the last campaign after the advanced polls had closed, saying, "Well, was there a heavy turnout?" I said, "Yeah, it's my guess is it's probably running at about twice what it was last time." "How do you know?" I said, "Well, I have a scrutineer in the poll." "What's a scrutineer?" I said, "Candidates are allowed to have agents in the polling station. What do?
Right.
They watch people vote. Why? For irregularities, right?" And
This
also
was a
they want to make sure
journalist asking these questions?
Yeah, they also want to make sure the votes get counted and reported properly. Like you scrutinize it. You're a scrutineer. "Oh, so do you know who voted?" I said, "I know everyone who voted. I know who voted illegally in my ward already." Like, "Yeah, of course. You cover your bets. You do everything." "Well, oh, because your dad was a politician." I said, "No, because I was a journalist and I had to cover elections." Right? So there's a sense that I get very frustrated. But on the other hand, it makes your job as a politician a little bit easier because you can spin them so quick. Like it's quite amazing at times, and I don't mean this to be mean to them. I feel kind of sorry for them. They don't have the time to sit there and do the investigation. I mean, one of the great luxuries as a journalist is to have the time to actually think and do and you know, run off on a whim and do some investigation, or play an angle, or massage a source, or develop the relationship outside City Hall that gets you to the information. I mean, the real trick of being a good City Hall journalist is never to be at City Hall. Right. Is to bring stories to City Hall, not report on what happens at City Hall. To cover politics, not government. But in this day and age, it's really all about making sure you're not more than 30 seconds away from Rob Ford to get what, you know, they're all waiting for him to explode. And I understand that. I covered City Hall when Mel Lastman was there. But I can tell you that as a journalist, there's some amazing stories. I mean, what's happening in Hyde Park around the rebuild of that play structure is going to be an extraordinary story, because it's going to show how quickly political organizations rewire themselves and can pull back into, you know, everyone wondered, wow, the Portlands, did they ever get organized quickly on that? No, it was the same folks from the airport who had extensive networks up and down the watershed system, pulling together a network and pushing it back out and multiplying it and pull it back in, and like constantly pushing and pulling to build your numbers and activate a network across the city very quickly, to the point where Jay Robinson got touched by it and bang, she's on side and they flipped the vote. That's a great story. The fact that those folks are out there organizing still around their issues. And so one of the laments I have about the press gallery is they are so hard done by their producers and the corporate overseers, that they're not in a position to do better journalism. And then it has nothing to do with the talent of the people there. They're all very talented people. But they also are so tied to whatever Rob Ford might do, in an environment where we've only got a minute 10 to do City Hall anyways. If he speaks for 40 seconds, that gives the rest of us 30 seconds to respond, and the responses can go all over the map. And so we don't have the great journalism. And so what you tend to find, where I tend to go for it now, you know, all fired up in the big smoke. You know, Ford for Toronto. There are some bloggers that are actually, you know, John Lawrence on spacing. There are some bloggers that are actually doing better journalism than the journalists are. More accurate.
Because they have the time.
Because I think is what the answer to their public, not to their producer.
And Matt Elliott's charts are being used in council.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I remember during the Miller election, my boss at City TV decided that the Island Airport wasn't an issue and to stop covering it. I was told you were not allowed to cover the Island Airport. So how am I going to cover this election? Miller is going to finish third. I said, I think you're wrong. I think he's going to win. I think the Island Airport is the issue, and I think we need to cover it. No, you can't do it. You can't do it. Fine. So I went off and I covered everything else and didn't touch the airport and didn't touch David Miller. And when David Miller jumped into the lead in the polls right after the provincial election, walked in and said, I told you so, and walked out. Didn't come back to work for 2 days. Go ahead, fire me. What do I care? Right? Like, you're going to fire me because you said David Miller wasn't a story and I said he was, and I got fired for that? You're really going to do that? Go ahead, do it. I didn't come back for 2 days. Walked back in. I said, now do I get to choose my stories? And they said, no, you walked off without being, you know, telling us where you're going. I said, fine. What's the next story I should be covering? Right? It was like that. And it was absurd. But you know, at one point, a producer, and this is, you know, came up to me and said, the only reason you got this job is because your father died. Right? I was like, fine. You know, I'll go back to the CBC where apparently I could get the job without killing my father. But it was the sense that you know, look, it's the double-edged sword. It's not the hardest burden to bear in your life, but it was you don't know what you know. It was going back to the comment about becoming a celebrity. Right. They didn't understand that the reason my dad was a good journalist wasn't because he could put a funny story together. It was because he understood what was going on at City Hall, and he understood how communities got organized politically, and he understood how change happened in Toronto. And he had his ear to the ground constantly. And that's the climate that I grew up in. And that's why I was able to fake it as a journalist and get stories on air that were interesting. But I was really doing political work. And when it got time to do politics, and they got interested in politics, which was around about every month before an election, they suddenly became the experts in great television. And they knew what they were talking about. They had good ratings and what have you. But when it came to political change, we were talking two different languages, and as a result, my stories didn't get there that year.
One last comment. I think journalists would be remiss to think that what they're doing is not political, because it's inherently political.
Yeah, I think that
it might be more the perception, the myths.
Personal or corporate politics, they might have a different view on it, and there are a lot of really good reporters there who just want to get the paycheck. They just want to get into a position where in 10 years from now they can still do some writing. You know, you'll often hear journalists talk about the 24 syndrome. To be a journalist nowadays, you have to be 24 years old, you have to work 24 hours a day for $24,000 a year, and after 24 months you're burned out and you're gone. And that's a very cynical approach to it. It's one of the reasons I got out of journalism, was I was tired of listening to a 24-year-old tell me about how much they knew about the world. And it's not to be mean to 24-year-olds. There are a lot of 24-year-olds who'll blow your socks off. And when you meet one, Marwa Al-Daldiri, I will listen to her till the day I'm dead.
Like out of 25.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not about being 24 and therefore I don't listen to
And you're about to be followed by another young 20-something journalist, too.
You got to have something to say. Right? And it's not just about being in the position to say something.
David?
I'd like to preface this question by apologizing for it, by saying I'm a 24-year-old journalist, and by saying that I think everyone else is kind of wondering this too. You talked about the next election as being one where council races rather than the mayor's seat will matter, but obviously your name has come up a lot as potentially someone who's considering running for mayor, or are people pressuring you to? Can you tell us a little bit about that, as well as if you're considering it?
You know, some people who are very close to me, and some people who who I respect, who aren't close to me, but nonetheless whose thinking I think is important thinking in the city, and you know, colleagues and stuff keep asking me, you know, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And they deserve an answer, because a decision has to be made by somebody and by people to figure out how to get a campaign going. So I would be wrong to say I'm not thinking about it, but I'm thinking about it because I've been asked to think about it. I'd be wrong to say that I'm going to, because I haven't come to a conclusion in my own mind. And I would also not be lying to you to tell you that we have really important work to be done at City Hall, and it's really hard to be a candidate and do that work. Nonetheless, the only successful candidates are the ones who stick at City Hall and do that work before they become mayor. So it's a process, and you had Shelley Carroll here a couple of weeks ago. I think when she asked that question, she said she's considering it. Shelley and I are actually considering it together and figuring out how it works, and we had lunch just the other week to make sure that it was not about you know, sort of turning people against one another or running each other down. In fact, one of the things I really don't like at City Hall is the way in which Liberals and New Democrats seem better at fighting each other sometimes than at fighting the Tories. You know, I'm decidedly not right-wing, and I'm decidedly not a conservative. After that, you know, my politics get a bit more creative and a bit more innovative, I think. But yeah, no, look, I've been asked to think about it, and I am thinking about it, and a lot goes into that decision. You know, I've got an 8-year-old kid I'd like to see every now and then. You know,
and speaking of which, what are the chances that the fall of the gerontocracy would be part of your platform?
Well, you know, you can't talk about youth and be old. It's you can be young at heart, but it's challenging. I mean, I honestly think that there's a generation, and I part of that, you know, demographic right in between the baby boomers and the echo generation. And so for all my life, I've been the youngest kid or the oldest kid in a movement. And maybe it's just fate had me born in 1961, and that's where you get placed in life, and you're not part of a demographic wave. I can live with that. It's not the end of the world not to be the. It's really nice to have people consider you, and I'm flattered. And I can't say it doesn't. You know, I like to throw it in Doug Ford's face, but I'm more interested in having a great mayor than having me be the mayor, and I'm more interested in having a good, strong council, a creative council. If we could have 10 more Kristen Wang-Tams on council, I wouldn't have to be the mayor. And I can assure you the person who was the mayor would be phenomenal. And so when I say that the issue is really the ward races, I'm deadly serious. If we can get rid of the Franstons, the Adas, you know, and put in somebody who actually represents that neighborhood from Weston Road, you know, or up on Lawrence in that area, that is actually fighting to make a difference in some of the worst housing in this city, and doesn't have someone on the Toronto Community Housing Board trying to destroy public housing, instead maybe building some public housing, expanding our capacity in that area, you know, the city would be different. And so, you know, I'm about change, and I'm prepared to help change the mayor, but I want to make sure we change council too.
Now, because King is one of our graduate students, we are indulging him in a very, very brief last question before we close.
All right, I just wanted to ask, like, what's your best method of developing trust in these neighborhoods that you're going into?
Being present.
Being present.
When I walk into Alex Park the first few years, I remember going by the basketball court, and one of the kids said, "Are you a cop?"
Yeah, I would probably ask the same thing.
and then after they got to know me and I went on the police services board, they got really nervous, but I had a badge. They actually give you a badge when you're on the police service board, and then they give you a letter that says all the places you're not allowed to show it, use it, or take it. Basically, anywhere than more about 2 feet away from your sock drawer, you're in big trouble. Yeah. But I came home with my kid, who was at that point, I think, about 6, and he wasn't going to bed, and I said, okay, I got a badge. You're going to bed. And he said, where's your uniform? I said, I'm undercover. Show me your gun. I don't have one. I don't do anything you have to say. You got no gun? Yeah, it's too smart. As I said, the younger generation has some leadership skills. But no, it's you've got to be present. And you've got to be present in good times and bad times. And you have to tell them why you can't help and tell them why you can. And you have to promise to help, but you can't overpromise, because
say what you mean to mean what you say.
You have to be real to them, and you have to be human to them. And when things are tough and you can't help, you got to be honest. And they respect that honesty. But you know, Marwa's mom, who's the matriarch of the community in a lot of ways, she's very, very principled and strong individual who worked very hard to get me elected the first time. And the day after the election, when I came back to thank everybody, said, now you're a politician, I don't trust you. I trusted you when you were a candidate. I don't trust you anymore unless you deliver. And then she told me what she wanted. And you have to deliver. And you can't over-promise and under-deliver. That'll kill you. And you can't under-promise and over-deliver, because then they think you're buying votes. You've just got to be constantly present, constantly real to them. And you know, they have to see that you're a neighbor. And as soon as they have that, as soon as you, I mean, I can go through that community now, and it's, hi, Mr. Vaughan, it's Adam. Please, just Adam's cool. What's your name?
So if we could give Adam a generous round of applause.